Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Sela's Social Studies. Today we're going to be covering our third installment of the Great Depression, and that is Roosevelt's response and his New Deal. So Election Day in 1932 put Republican incumbent Herbert Hoover versus New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt. After an attempt by Hoover to persuade the public that Roosevelt's policies would ruin the nation, Americans en masse ignored the tactics and voted blue. The decision was a landslide victory for Roosevelt as he earned 58% of the popular vote and 89% of the electoral vote. This election was the second worst defeat for Republicans in the history of presidential elections. The United States will have a new president to combat the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, or FDR, took office in March of 1933 and promised Americans that economic recovery was possible. FDR opposed Hoover's idea that Americans should pull themselves up by the bootstraps, and he promised that the nation will have the force of the federal government behind it to lead it to prosperity. Roosevelt ran on a public policy that citizens of the United States were dealt a bad hand of cards and they deserved a New Deal. The New Deal would become the name of his domestic policies that would shape the nation for the next decade. Every president today is judged quickly in their administration by how much they can accomplish in their first 100 days. This stems back to Roosevelt's administration. Speaking to the nation through the radio on Fireside Chats, he told the nation that he called a special session of Congress together to get the wheels started on the New Deal. And this act would continue onwards, allowing the public to judge incoming administrations on their first 100 days. Roosevelt and Congress worked together to create new government-sponsored programs that would be successful in battling the Depression and encourage economic recovery. It is these programs that became the official domestic policy known as the New Deal. Within the first 100 days of office, Roosevelt and his staff knew that the first order of business was to attempt to fix the banking issues across the nation. Roosevelt worked quickly to restore the public's confidence in America's banks. After the stock market crashed, millions of Americans lost everything, and those who didn't took their money out of banks and hid their assets under their bed or in a shoebox, anywhere, as long as the banks couldn't get their hands on it. During the Depression, nearly 10,000 banks would close across the United States because of the mass withdrawal of funds. In an attempt to stabilize the banking system, on March 9, 1933, Roosevelt signed the Emergency Banking Relief Act. The act ordered all banks to temporarily close for 1 week. Auditors would go into the banks and audit or inspect the finances of the bank, and banks were put into categories to create an order of reopenings. First, banks that were solvent could reopen immediately, and next, the banks that successfully passed the audit were allowed to reopen. Finally, the banks that failed the audit were assisted by the Treasury Department to get their finances in order, and then they could reopen. Roosevelt assured Americans that it was safer to put your money in a newly reopened bank than keep it under your mattress. The Emergency Banking Relief Act worked, and by the next month, when the banks reopened, deposits exceeded withdrawals for the first time since the crash. The banking crisis was over. FDR's cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, was elected president in 1900 and had a square deal that consisted of 3 C's to help Americans. And keeping with the family legacy, Roosevelt's New Deal came with the 3 R's to assist the nation. First, Roosevelt promised relief for American families. Second, to reform the nation. And finally, to recover the economy. President Roosevelt would also be the first president to be in constant communication with the public as well. He would address the nation through a series of speeches in which he spoke directly to the people through the radio. The series of communication would become known as Fireside Chats because it was pictured that people would be sitting next to their fireplaces listening to the president on the radio. It is estimated that between 50 and 80 million Americans tuned in for their Fireside Chats. With so many Americans joining the ranks of the unemployed, Roosevelt knew change needed to happen quickly, and if private corporations wouldn't hire laborers, then the federal government would. Between 1933 and 1935, he approved over 8 programs that put millions of men to work or protected Americans, their money, and longevity. These programs or acts have long names but were well known to the public by acronyms, and Roosevelt passed so many that they were compared to alphabet soup. We will go through a number of the programs and their purposes. In March of 1933, the Farm Credit Administration, or FCA, was passed to help farmers refinance their mortgages, allowing them to keep their farms. Next up was one of the top employment programs, the Civilian Conservation Corps. In April 1933, the CCC was created for young men, unmarried men, between the ages of 17 and 25. They left their homes to move across the country and live in military-style camps and built state parks, reservoirs, and bridges. Overall, the CCC put over 2 million men to work. In May of 1933, the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Agricultural Adjustment Acts were passed. The TVA hired roughly 10,000 men to build hydroelectric dams and generators across the Tennessee River Valley. The AAA was created to stabilize agricultural prices. The AAA paid farmers not to grow certain crops, which resulted in low supply and high demand of products, creating a price increase. In June of 1933, FDR attacked monetary security and passed the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, otherwise known as the FDIC. The FDIC is one of the New Deal programs that is still around today. It is a government agency that was designed to make banking safer for consumers. Learning from the stock market crash and how people removed all of their savings, leaving millions with nothing, the FDIC offered insurance on consumer deposits. Originally, deposits were insured up to $5,000 and gradually increased to $100,000, maxing out at $250,000 today. If another crash happened, Americans would not lose everything. The government would insure and repay funds, guaranteed. Finally, in November 1933, the Civil Works Administration, or the CWA, put over 4 million men to work building large projects like roads and airports. Fast forward to 1935 and the creation of the largest government program that put men to work. In May of 1935, the Works Progress Administration was created. Overall, the WPA put over 9 million men to work building roads and bridges across the country. The majority of the laborers barely made a livable wage, but they were willing to work for anything. Critics of the WPA labeled it "wee piddle around" because of how spread out it was and the variety of work it was doing, believing it was a waste of taxpayers' money. The WPA also put artists to work and helped create a timestamp of the era. Famous literary genius John Steinbeck explored the deep genre of depression and wrote stories that relate to the times. Musicians Woody Guthrie dabbled in themes of struggle which reflected everyday life during a depression. However, with the success of some depression artists, many themes of music and writing attempted to block the daily life of the grind. The radio played swing music to help people forget their pains, and popular radio shows attempted to make people laugh, while millions raced to the theater to watch the newest film. Because even if it was only 1 hour that you could imagine yourself somewhere else, it was better than where you really were. In August 1935, the Social Security Act was passed. The SSA was the first time in history that the federal government took responsibility for the citizens' economic well-being. The act provided some financial security to the elderly, the disabled, the unemployed, and even children. The Social Security Act was funded by a new tax on workers and employers. The SSA is another program that is still around today. Americans showed their support of FDR in the congressional elections of 1934, electing pro-New Deal legislators. Roosevelt continued to introduce legislation that would become known as the Second New Deal. Unlike the past, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was very vocal in support of the New Deal programs. In 1933, Roosevelt passed the National Industrial Recovery Act, which required a minimum wage and allowed labor unions to collective bargaining. The Supreme Court declared this act unconstitutional, stating that the government could not enforce these rules. This was one of many clashes between Roosevelt and the Supreme Court. In 1935, the National Labor Relations Act was passed, which allowed workers to join labor unions, and the National Labor Relations Board was established to oversee union activities. That same year, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO, was organized workers from the United States and Canada into unions based on industry and not skill level. and this allowed African Americans, Hispanics, women, and immigrants as members as well. The CIO led a sit-down strike against General Motors in which they stayed in the factories so they could not be replaced by new workers. After the success of the first New Deal programs, there was another presidential election in 1936. President Roosevelt ran against a Republican from Kansas, Alf Landon. The election was almost over before it even started. FDR was reelected by a huge margin, gaining over 60% of the popular vote and over 98% of the electoral vote. Roosevelt and the federal government were able to help the nation to an extent. Economist John Keynes came up with a theory that will later bear his name, the Canesian Theory, about how one person's spending can control another's earnings. Keynes believed that the government could directly influence the demand for goods and services by altering taxes. President Roosevelt continued to create government programs to assist Americans. However, he could not push all of them through. As president, FDR signed over 4,000 executive orders, but the Constitution and the balance of powers allowed the Supreme Court to keep the president in check. The Supreme Court issued a series of rulings declaring in several New Deal programs unconstitutional, which angered Roosevelt. In response, FDR proposed a plan for reorganizing the federal judiciary. Roosevelt proposed that if a justice was over 70 years old and did not retire, the president could place a judge on the court. This would have allowed FDR to appoint 6 justices and seriously pack the court in his favor. Critics of the plans were harsh and accused Roosevelt of trying to change the balance of power that was defined by the Constitution. Ultimately, Congress rejected the bill, but Roosevelt was the true winner because the Supreme Court did not try and overturn any more New Deal legislation. While Roosevelt was enormously popular with Americans, he had his critics within the government. Some members of the Senate, like Huey Long, believed that the New Deal did not do enough for Americans. Long believed that the New Deal was geared towards helping businesses and not the poor, and he believed that the rich should pay extra taxes to help support the poor. Some right-wing politicians believed that the New Deal went too far. Many criticized the expansion of the federal government and felt that it was based on socialism. The American Liberty League believed it made FDR more of a king than a president, and businesses were worried about a raise in taxes. However you feel about the New Deal, it did not get the United States out of depression, but it was able to help millions of Americans. All right, guys, we'll see you on our next installment of the Great Depression, our 4th and final one called American Impact. I'll see you next time.